I love your outfit, by the way. That's very like fashionista, very unlawyery.
Well, my office is usually it's like no suit unless you have clients in the office, so I get to get away with it. And I said to my boyfriend this morning, I was like, I unintentionally wore Bitcoin orange for this podcast. I didn't
I
really
didn't
think
even,
about it, and I was like, I am wearing Bitcoin orange is really what I'm wearing.
I didn't actually think of that, but now that you mention it, you are wearing Bitcoin orange.
Like, it's literally that. Yeah, it's kind of funny. All
Perfect.
right, I think we
So
are situated. Yeah.
we are, yeah, we are. We've got all the right angles, all the right lighting. I guess it would be really great actually. Let me just I'm going to put this on speaker gallery so it just switches when somebody's talking. Yeah, so welcome, first of all, and thank you for doing the interview. And yeah, I mean, it'd be really great actually if you could introduce yourself. I was really interested to have a conversation with you because you've obviously got a background in law. We met in Miami. You're a practicing lawyer in the crypto space, and there is so much going on in this space right now. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, I guess, to do an intro.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I am really looking forward to doing this. As you said, there's a lot going on, and it is at times difficult to keep up, but we're very busy. I have been practicing for about it'll be 9 years this fall. I have litigation. I practice primarily litigation, general commercial litigation. I have a wide range of areas, but I've practiced quite a bit with large and small tech companies, in sort of normal run-of-the-mill general commercial suits, but also in sort of partnership disputes and that kind of thing. And when I started with Carrington about 5 years ago, I knew that we had a digital assets industry practice group, but I wasn't working with Alex Moore, my colleague at the time. And so when I was assigned to him as an associate, he asked me, he said, look, you don't have to do the weird crypto law, but if you want to, I would love somebody to help me with it. And I said, no, sure, I'm very interested. My boyfriend has been very, very deep in crypto for a long time. I think he convinced me to invest in Bitcoin like 8 years ago or so, or maybe
Wow.
7 years ago. So that is something I jokingly refer to myself as a unrealized Luna Classic millionaire. Because he also convinced me to invest in Luna as it was decoupling on the way down. And if they ever burn it all off, maybe I won't have to work anymore. So I said, great, sure. And I've been working with him ever since. We've built out at the firm a pretty well-rounded team. My colleague Andrea has a background in art law and is very deep, obviously, into the NFT space and also on the intellectual property side. And we do, I would say, a fair amount. Bread and butter is securities and compliance work, of which there is quite a bit. Bitcoin Miami was an interesting experience this year because 2 years ago, when we started going to that conference, nobody wanted to talk to lawyers. They all said, "Oh, we don't need to talk to you." And now the tables have turned a little bit, and everybody is starting to realize that there is some need to at least talk to a compliance lawyer if you want to be in this space. So it's an unfortunate reason, I'll say, given what the SEC's take on this industry has been. But it's good from my perspective because I do think I see the industry growing up significantly over the last 2 years. And I know that that's sort of on the agenda for us to talk about, but it is, I mean, yes, it's also good for business, but it is good to see people are actually taking it seriously and taking compliance seriously, because I think everybody is realizing that no compliance or low compliance is not going to be the way that we continue to handle this industry in the US, at least. So
Yeah.
that's a little bit about me and my background.
So how long did you practice law for before you shifted to the crypto industry? Like, what was that trajectory?
Um,
Did you?
I guess it was about 3 years ago that I joined the practice group, and it is not, I would say that I still do the normal stuff too. If we could just work in crypto, that would be lovely, but I still do all the normal things. And a lot of the litigation matters that I've handled have been, frankly, very, very normal litigation issues that are just have a crypto twist. And I think some lawyers don't want to touch it because it makes them nervous. And so they don't take them on. I've represented quite a few, particularly Bitcoin mining companies who have had like landlord disputes, right? Like that's a very, very run of the mill problem. Doesn't really involve a lot of specialized knowledge, but that's been a very a piece of this practice that has grown in the last couple of years, particularly in Texas, which is very mining friendly. But really, it was an opportunity, and I really like representing what I would call like emerging tech companies because it gives me the opportunity to do something that isn't my job, which is to sort of do a little bit more consulting and advisory work that isn't just going to the courthouse and yelling at the opposing counsel, right? I like that too. That is the majority of my practice. But this gives me a different way of practicing law, and a lot more puts me in a different position, and frankly in a specialty that I wouldn't have necessarily picked up. And so I'm very grateful to the firm for being very receptive to having this practice group, and it's really grown in the last few years as we bring more people on who have complementary expertise and in the space, and growing that knowledge base together.
What kind of expertise do you need as a lawyer then in this space? Is it understanding the technology? Is it understanding like the types of disputes? Are they specific to this industry, like to the Bitcoin/crypto industry? Or what are the kind of skill sets that you need that are different to regular law practice, I guess?
I believe that, and this is true in any situation. If I was going to pick up a microchip case tomorrow, I would want to understand the technology of a microchip. That's really my personality more than anything. But one thing that I think separates our team from maybe some of the other bigger law firms that just hang out a shingle that says, oh yeah, we also do digital assets, is we do really make an effort to understand the underlying technology. Because frankly, and I've been saying this since I started, I hear this sort of fiat is dead rhetoric and all of that, and I that is a lovely thought, but really from my perspective, this is a technology. It is a technology that is very, very young and growing very, very rapidly, but has so many different applications that nobody has even touched yet. And so it should be treated in a way. It doesn't require a lot of special skills in that way, but it does require a willingness, I think, to be a good cryptocurrency lawyer, to want to understand the thing you're talking about. And yes, the Satoshi white paper made my eyes cross a few times, but I got there and we did it. And I certainly don't have a computer science background. I am not very tech savvy myself, but it's you pick up the terminology and the methods and what the thing is capable of in the course of working with your clients. And my clients teach me something every single time I take on a new one, which is great. There hasn't been a lot of very, very new, very different technology in a while. We were in a meeting on Monday and they were talking about a speech that had been given in Congress about the internet, and how when the internet happened, everybody said, we don't know what this is yet, so we're going to let it grow and do its thing. And we're just going to tax and regulate the things that are on top of it that people are selling out of it. But the actual thing, we're not going to touch. And it's a little funny thinking about that now, because if that was the position that, the lawmakers and the regulators would take, I think we would be seeing a much different landscape than we are now. But from my perspective, that is what blockchain is. Whether you want to talk about, Luna, or you want to talk about Bitcoin, or you want to talk about mining, it is about a technology. And so I think to be a competent practitioner in the space, you have to have some facility with the technology. And I am not ascribing to be a coder or anything like that. But again, I'm not afraid to ask my clients to sit me down and explain it to me. And I think that's very important, particularly when, crypto clients today have to do a lot more than just exist in the world. They have to defend themselves on a fairly regular basis. And I can't be a good advocate for a client if I don't understand what they're doing and why it's not, selling drugs on the Silk Road. This is the thing, is that everybody, I had a hearing a few months ago about some miners that were sitting in a warehouse we couldn't get to because of a landlord dispute. And I had to say, Judge, there's no great, we don't have a significant difference here between this and a server. And the Bitcoin miners are going to come at me, but that's all it is. It's just a server. Yes, there's some additional equipment. There's a shipping container that it's in, but that's all that it is. And that is, we act a little bit as translators, I think, for our clients, because I think a lot of people, when they hear crypto, they just think about, I don't know, Super Mario Brothers coins, or something to that effect.
Well, can I ask what the biggest can I ask what the biggest challenges are from a legal perspective? I mean, is it like, what are the things that end up, obviously the example that you've given is very much like you say, it's just a land dispute. So it could be any kind of company, any kind of, piece of equipment. But what are the typical things that you see the most come up in litigation? Like, is it issues around tokenization? Is it issues around the fact that these are or aren't securities? Like, what's the most common thing that a crypto / Bitcoin firm might run into challenges with?
So I think there's two buckets of this. I think it's just, if you run a business, there will always be challenges, and there will be very, very normal run-of-the-mill problems, sort of like the landlord dispute example. Like, that's not a special problem. Anybody can get in a dispute with their landlord and have to go through that process. But particularly to the Bitcoin space, I think there's a couple of big issues. One, obviously, is the security angle. And frankly, that's becoming all encompassing. You might be familiar with the lawsuit with respect to NBA Top Shots, right? Everybody, when that came out, it's a digital trading card. That's all it is. It truly, truly, truly should not be considered a security even if you squint your eyes really, really hard. And there was a class action lawsuit filed against Dapper Labs for securities fraud, and on a motion to dismiss, which is not a merits motion, but on a motion to dismiss, the court said, I think they've pled enough to state a claim that this is a security. And so if something like that is going to be, on the table, then frankly, it begs the question, what isn't a security? And that, I think, number one, major challenge for many aspects of the industry, from Bitcoin miners to, even to NFTs, which I think people think traditionally have been outside of that purview. The SEC has been taking a very broad brush approach to their enforcement actions. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail, but it is by far the number one sort of threat, I think, to the industry at this moment. But I would say the second thing that I think is coming and isn't maybe as well addressed, and we're starting to see this bubble up, is IP issues, intellectual property protections for your stuff. The Yuga Labs case, which hasn't been completely resolved, but is on its way to being resolved.
That's the Bored Apes, right?
Yes. Our colleague kept asking, well, why didn't they file for copyright infringement? Like, clearly, copyright infringement is the easy one. They were going after a trademark infringement claim. Well, lo and behold, it comes out in this process that they don't own the copyright to the Bored Apes. Oops.
Oh, what?
So,
How is that even possible?
Exactly. And I can't remember forgive me, I forget the exact details, but they are licensing it from somebody else that isn't, I don't think, crypto related. And so there, we didn't see it as much at Bitcoin Miami, but we went to Consensus this year, and the amount of, for example, like blockchain gaming that's blowing up right now, frankly, because they think it's safe, and they're probably right from an SEC perspective, hopefully. But I see a universe in which all of that stuff there's gonna be major disputes about the IP in connection with that, because I just don't think that some of these nascent companies that want to get into the space are thinking through those very basic problems. And again, because of the nature of the technology being as open source as it is, you got to do what you've got to do to protect yourself. And so that, we've been saying that we think securities obviously is the number one issue of the day, but in 2 years, we're going to be having panels about how to protect your IP and what you should have been doing. And the good news story there, to a certain degree, is that that's easier, because we don't have the situation in the securities realm where we don't know what to do with how to comply. The theme of this is tell us how to comply, SEC, and they're just enforcing. And so, at least with respect to the IP, there will be some curly cues, I am certain, that come out of that process. But there are ways to do this that are fairly straightforward. You should definitely consult an IP counsel, but there are ways to protect your IP that don't have to be bespoke to the technology. But it's something that everybody should be thinking about.
I want to come back to that IP question, but just, you made a point about the gaming companies that I just wanted to go back to. You were saying that they feel safe because of the type of business that they have. Do you mean that they have like a token that is utilized on their gaming platform, and it's a closed, like a walled garden, and therefore you can't withdraw and start spending that token somewhere else? Is that what you mean?
In theory, and I think that some of them some of them have thought through this maybe a little bit more than others. But yeah, I think that the gaming companies they're saying, look, we're not, you're building your avatars and all of this, and there's NFTs that are associated with that, and all of that character development. Those are the ones I'm seeing primarily. There's sort of that group that's just doing that, and that has no, yeah, sure, maybe you can sell it, but it's not. That's really just a consumer transaction. That would be the argument. Again,
the sale of the NFT.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
It's to say, we have this thing. I can sell I can sell something. It's like creating a piece of art, right? In theory, that should not be a security. There's a little bit more of a gray area with some of the entities, I think, that are doing some, like, there are coins that are associated with the game, and there might be some secondary market kind of stuff going on. Those, I think, are a little bit of a closer question. But frankly, the SEC hasn't gotten there yet. And so, there might be some sense that their people are feeling a little bit safer. I do wonder if that will continue, but I think the SEC's got a lot on its plate right now. And there is, I think, a sense of, if you're small enough, they've got big fish to go after. They're not quite going after the small ones yet. Maybe. And so just to come back
to the IP question then. So when you say about protecting IP, what does that mean? So in the case of the Bored Apes, that's fairly straightforward. It's, your Bored Ape, essentially. It's a piece of art, like you say, or like a copyright of an image. But what would be IP, for example, in a gaming platform or in any other kind of service that you've seen? Like, what kind of IP should founders be thinking about?
So I think, and I should give a disclaimer that I am not an IP lawyer, but I've dabbled enough. And I think what I would say is that even the images, the characters, like all of that kind of basic stuff of how you build out your universe and what your terms of service say about who owns what, like those are all things that founders in that space should be thinking about, is how to protect the thing that is in the game, and it's not necessarily about what the consumer is building on the platform. It's about your build out and how you're protecting all the images and the trademarks and everything else. Like again, those concepts fit very nicely into existing IP law. So it is in theory a very solvable problem, but I think people are not necessarily thinking all the way through all the issues. And I do think terms of service and who owns what and when, and this has come up a little bit in the securities context as well with the different exchanges that we've seen the SEC going after, is like who owns what and what does that look like? Like all of those things are things that as you're embarking in this space, the more button down you are, or at least as much as you're trying to button down, I think the better for your business as you're sort of moving forward, not just from the regulators, but from competitors as well. I mean, it is a very competitive space. We see this all the time, and I think particularly in the sort of more consumer facing B2C kind of situations. Like you've got to worry about regulators, yes, but you've also got to worry about the guy down the street also creating a blockchain gaming company. I mean, that's just the nature of business in this country, rightfully or wrongfully.
I have a question as well about I don't know if this is something that you have insight into, but where jurisdictional laws differ. So let's say, for example, I mean, maybe this is a bad example, but let's pretend that China becomes extremely liberal about allowing sort of crypto businesses to flourish. Probably not going to happen in the short term, but let's say it does. And it says, right, we're just going to make this a super friendly location, like crypto businesses can, come here and flourish. How does that then impact US law? So if the US was to be very restrictive and China was to be very open, if you're a business and you're domiciled in China, but say US persons can access your services either directly or through an VPN, how does that actually work in terms of international law? Like the reason I ask is that the UK has a law that I believe is coming out sometime in October. And it essentially says that if you have a crypto product that a UK person can see, i.e. it's on the internet, then you've got certain regulations that you need to adhere to from an advertising perspective. And I just thought that was a really interesting legal kind of question, because how on earth can you require every single company in the entire world to comply to UK laws about crypto advertising just because somebody goes on the internet and goes to a certain address, IP address, and sees what's in there? It's a very, I don't know, how does that work from a legal perspective?
That strikes me. I mean, that is I guess that's a version of, KYC and AML, right? Is to say, look, if you're going to publish and you're going to be accessible from all jurisdictions, you got to do, these things from an advertising perspective. I believe that there is some ability for platforms and companies to basically prevent visibility from if you've got a IP address that originates from a specific location, then we can't even see the platform. That would be a way to manage that. It depends on how onerous those obligations are, right? If a company is willing to comply with those advertising requirements, then perhaps it's, they'll just do it and it will be part of their compliance strategy. But I do believe that there are ways to restrict access. And I know, for example, that, some companies, this has been advice that they've been given in terms of taking money, exchanges or whatever, just don't take US money and prevent US onboarding. Now, do I think that that's that is a strategy? I think it is, what I would call the safer strategy, but I think you and I can both agree that there are lots of ways for, if somebody really wants to put money on a platform and that's the requirement is that they don't have a US IP address, there are plenty of ways to get around that, and to no fault maybe of the operation. But there are ways to get around that. And so that's not a great, it's not a great strategy, because I think there's lots of holes, and even if you have the best intentions, it's a problem. In terms of how the concept,
I
Yeah.
think, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I think that law relates to being able to see the advertisement. So I guess if you did an IP restriction, then you've met your, I would hope you've met your obligations as an organization to say, you know, I've restricted British IP addresses from seeing this. And if somebody circumvents that, well, that's on them. I didn't allow them to see it. Yeah. So I can see
Right.
what that, how that would
There,
make sense.
and I'm not familiar with that specific law, that, you know, that, which sounds more, that's more on the sort of consumer protection side.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't surprise me if there was some kind of language about like what, you know, if you want to restrict like what you can do. Certainly somebody has thought about this, right? Particularly with respect to the internet. I mean, I'm not aware of anything. I'm certainly not aware of anything coming down the pipe from a federal perspective on that idea. Excuse me, but that would be an interesting thought experiment. I hope. I think they're caught up on the securities angle, not necessarily the advertising angle. But I would hope that we wouldn't see something like that in this country. We've got enough problems with keeping crypto business in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing because in some ways it's the thing that I find quite interesting about this. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but I find it quite interesting because then the expectation is that any company should be aware of these laws that are coming in. And if you're domiciled in, I don't know, Brazil, and you're building out a business and, you know, everything's in Portuguese, why would you even know that the UK had brought this law in? You know, how would you even have access to have that knowledge? Like, there's no way that you could possibly know that just off the bat. I don't know, or is there?
I mean, I think that when you're you know, opening a business on the internet, so to speak, or bringing some kind of technology business into the world and understanding where you're going to do business, those lines are so blurred now. The world has become so much smaller in a way. And as a result of that, I think when you're thinking, especially in an industry that is under so much scrutiny as blockchain technology, it really does require, I mean, I'll put it this way. You can hang a shingle and you can start an exchange or a Bitcoin ATM company. And if you just say, look, we're going to do it and come what may, that is a compliance strategy. And you know, that is a strategy. Or you can say we're domiciled in the Bahamas, they can come after, you know, they can try to come after us. Frankly, I think that was the attitude, you know, 4 years ago. We're not really very far away from that. And there may be still some companies who have maybe not learned from the past 4 years that are approaching it from that perspective, from a much more like simplistic black and white view. But it is the question of who I can accept money from and what laws that will subject me to is a very, very complicated process. And I mean, it should be something that is reviewed by a lawyer, to help you understand, you know, what the obligations are and how to mitigate your risks in the various jurisdictions, because there are plenty of jurisdictions that are very, very crypto friendly and are doing a really good job of coming out with good faith, good sense regulation. I mean, Europe has MiCA, which is, you know, is something, and it appears to be well thought out. They're frankly way ahead of us on this in from that perspective. I think in the email that you sent me before this, you mentioned like the Middle East is starting to pop its head up, and which was only a matter of time, and say, hey, we want to join, you know, the fight, so to speak. And I'm not as familiar with, I know that they're doing a lot, and there's been a lot of investment in Middle Eastern blockchain companies, but I'm not aware of exactly what their regulatory system looks like. But my colleague Alex said he had a client call him once, and they said, we hear that France is really crypto friendly, and we're like, maybe. Our firm is in the process right now of building out a working group we are part of a international association of law firms called Multi-Law, and we're in the process of building out a working group for all of the different offices in the various jurisdictions that have crypto practice groups, of which there are quite a few in the group. And so that will be an effort for us to be able to give advice to clients who have just decided, it's too hard in the US, I'm going to give it 2 years and I'm going to go and, try to get started and get moving in France or in, Abu Dhabi or whatever it is. And we want to be able to, while I personally would like to see the US get out of its own way and, and keep the innovation here, we have clients that have to, manage their risk however they see fit. So, that is, we are undertaking an effort to become more knowledgeable in sort of all of the different places, because all of the different jurisdictions have different views, and some are further ahead, at least in terms of putting pen to paper, than others. But
also they're changing the whole time so quickly. I mean, they're not consistent. So yeah, it's not as if like, people establish laws and then that's it, they stay. They seem to vary a lot. That's really great though, that you're going to offer more of an international service, because I think that's one of the things that's really challenging, is if you do have challenges in your local jurisdiction, you don't really know off the bat if you've got other options. So having that kind of availability is great. Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about just some of the recent stuff, because one of the observations that I've had about these supposed crypto kind of legal issues, to your earlier point, a lot of these just seem like very normal litigation issues, but they do seem to happen with quite a lot of frequency to crypto firms. So for example, obviously we had FTX last year. There's been a whole raft of legal issues with companies that predate FTX. And then you've got Prime Trust, what happened in the last few days, where I was reading that they literally just lost their keys and then started spending fiat to buy back the credit. I mean, that was just wild to me, that their whole business model was as a custodian. And I'm just wondering, this is, I guess, more of an opinion from you rather than a legal opinion, but why is it that this seems to be happening so much to firms in the crypto space? Is it just that it's a new industry and a lot of the people running these firms are inexperienced, or like it just feels like there's always some issue and then it's a crypto firm and the issue has nothing to do with crypto, but everything to do with just like bad practices of running a company?
It does beg the question. And this was, I made a point earlier about like the industry is growing up a lot, right? And so frankly, I think a lot of the scrutiny that crypto firms are under, which it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg, right? It's like, would we be hearing so much about this if the scrutiny wasn't as high as it was? But I've been saying that, like, I think the memory tale of, the Mount Goxes of the world, which happened eons ago in the sort of, in as fast as blockchain technology moves, eons ago, there's still a hangover from that. And there's still, we see this with, even in the normal traditional finance space, like the Gamecoin thing, they're still talking about, or sorry, not Gamecoin, they're still talking about GameStop, and how GameStop is, that's still something that comes up at the congressional hearings on blockchain. And, the memory, I think, is still long that we're seeing the reaction, I think, takes time. At least the reaction that we see is taking time. So I think that those two things have created a little bit of a perfect storm for some companies that, opened, maybe didn't have the greatest compliance strategy, but are now, operating differently. Prime Trust may be an exception to that rule based on what I've read so far, because that seemed to be fairly recent. But, the finances of the world, and I mean, Coinbase is a prime example of this. They have tried every which way but Sunday to figure out how to make this work in the space. And, then they get slapped with a Wells notice and then, then an SEC enforcement action. And it does beg the question, why are we here? why are we here? Why are we not? I think I heard that they were going to move their derivatives exchange to Bermuda. I believe I think the US entity is still here, but how long? And
well,
so
what would their options be from a legal standpoint? Because can you, especially for audiences that are maybe not in America, like, can you sort of break down what a Wells notice is and then what the SEC action is and how they differ?
So a Wells notice is like is the sort of warning, right? It's the, hey, we are gonna investigate. We think that there's some things that are going on. We are putting you on notice that we are, that we're investigating, and it's a little bit more public. You can have an investigation without it being so public, but a Wells notice is sort of a public, like, sort of the, like, hey, we're gonna start digging around. The enforcement action grows out of what comes out of that process. And the question is always, will the Wells notice then turn into an enforcement action? And that's what we saw with Coinbase.
Yeah.
And in that process. And Coinbase made a choice, and frankly, I think it was, whether it was a good choice, it was a choice that was made. And I think it's good for the industry for them to say, they responded to the Wells notice publicly and said, we got this, we're going to fight it tooth and nail. This is not appropriate. We take the position that we cannot comply without better rules, and it's, the SEC's fault. That was a very, most companies, when they get a Wells notice, don't say anything about it. The movement was fairly traditional. It wasn't anything, odd from that perspective. But I think the SEC is looking at the big players and is trying to, frankly, I don't know what the SEC is really, what the ultimate point is. I mean, from their perspective, they're saying, well, it's investor protection. That's their guiding light. It does beg the question, if Coinbase is publicly traded and you're bringing an enforcement action, is that really in the investors who are investors in the company? Is that really in their best interest? Particularly when you let them IPO, although an IPO is not necessarily a pass on whether it's a security, whether it's an appropriate business model. As my colleague likes to say, they let a Bigfoot hunting company go public. So, that's not necessarily a good litmus test, but it does beg the question. And we had a meeting on Monday, actually, with Congressman French Hill, who is he's the chair of the digital assets subcommittee for Congress, or for the House. And he has just put forward a bill that would address a compliance structure for crypto specifically. It is very, very long, but it does the work that needed to be done, and has put sort of a flag in the ground to say, look, this is what we need. What we have is not good enough to address this new technology. And the longer that we continue to waffle and enforce, legislate by enforcement, the more that we are going to be behind other, powers in the, other countries in the world who are going down this compliance route. And so that bill, it has a good shot in the House. We don't know exactly how well it will do in the Senate, but it's a start. And we're very supportive of his efforts, and having watched some of the congressional hearings, it is good to know that there are people who actually get it and understand the plight and what is happening, because and frankly, what we heard from him was, we need better education for the people who don't understand but understand that there's a problem, but don't understand exactly the solution and how it works and all of those things. They need education. And the thing that we have been advising clients who are asking us, how do we weather this storm at this moment? It's sort of twofold. It's, let's evaluate what your strategy is and come up with something that, there's going to be no zero risk strategy, but we can try to find it. But the other thing is, lobby your congresspeople, because this is something that has now, maybe the silver lining of all of this is it's raised itself to the national attention, and a lot of Congress understands that this is happening, and it's gaining a lot of momentum in the press and on the internet. The Twitter takedown of the Prometheum witness for the most recent digital asset subcommittee hearing was pretty aggressive and completely unjustified. But I think that we are seeing that there's a national platform being created, and people need to take advantage of that. And we see this, that people are a little bit hesitant to raise their hand because they're worried about getting slapped with an enforcement action. But I think what Coinbase is doing in sort of saying, we're taking the fight and we're going to fight this fight and we're going to go down the road, I hope they continue that for the good of the industry, and at least to sort of keep this in the national attention, because I do think it will help the people in Congress who actually want to fix this problem. I think it will help them bring that across the line.
Yeah, it's quite wild actually that in the US you've got, I think 4 is the current count of presidential runners who are openly supportive of Bitcoin and openly disparaging about CBDCs. I just think this time last year, I would not in my wildest dreams have imagined that would be the case. It's really nuts. We don't actually in the UK have that level of discourse. I think our Prime Minister sort of talks about it. I mean, he's if I can say it, he's a shitcoiner, but he basically talks openly about being supportive of like CBDCs and of crypto, but clearly doesn't understand the difference between that and Bitcoin and, all of these different technologies. Or if he does, he's certainly not saying so. And we don't really have, I think we have one MP who talks about this sort of fairly openly and sort of advocates against CBDCs, but we really don't have the level of discourse that there is in the US. I wanted to ask you about Coinbase. So what are Coinbase's options as a company then from the sort of standpoint? So if they decided to fight this enforcement action, are there options basically fight it, hope that they win? If they don't win, what happens? Does that mean that they would just move their operations to a different jurisdiction and exit the US? I mean, is that the most likely outcome?
I hope not. But they have a few options. I mean, in anybody in litigation, which is what this is, the SEC, as many government agencies are wont to do, the SEC doesn't want to take a loser, so to speak. But the SEC also doesn't actually want to try this case to a jury. And so, because that would be an interesting experiment. But they will likely offer Coinbase a deal at some point. I don't know how soon that will happen, but there will be a deal that's offered. Coinbase could take the deal, they could negotiate the deal, or they could say, no, we're going to fight, we're going to take this to the mat, which is what they've been saying, at least to date. That's probably a long way away in the life cycle. I mean, a normal litigation process to get to trial is 2 years on a good day. This one probably longer than that, given the size and the scope of the issues, even with the prior investigation. And so they've got a long row to hoe, and it will be a fight. And that is, it seems to me that that's what they've chosen. If they lose or lose partially, depending on how it all gets carved up, they can appeal. And, there's been at least some disputes at the appellate level, and some indication from certain courts of appeals that they believe that the SEC is overreaching. I don't know if you're familiar with the separate lawsuit that that Coinbase filed against the SEC related to their request for rulemaking, and that is pending in the Third Circuit, which is Pennsylvania and others. Probably, I hope I got that right. And the Third Circuit is basically called Coinbase, or I'm sorry, the SEC in and said, okay, when are you going to do this rulemaking? You've been sitting on this for however long. When are you going to do it? And issued a show cause order and made them come in and explain themselves, and said, okay, you've got 4 months, and they have to have a status conference in 4 months to figure out where they are. So there is some, I don't know, I think activism might be the wrong word, but there is some appetite for, at the appellate level, to take a harder look at what the SEC is doing. And so that would be an option for them. And I'm actually, I have to say, I'm not entirely sure which circuit if Coinbase lost the enforcement action where it would go. But there is some interesting things that are going on at the circuit level. And then, of course, they could appeal it to the Supreme Court if that was happening. And the Supreme Court has also been giving interesting indications about their position on agency discretion. You might have heard of what they call Chevron deference, which is basically a doctrine that says if a regulatory agency that is created by Congress does a rulemaking, then sort of like on its face, it has the force of congressional authority, which was a decision that was made a long time, not very long ago, but many, many years ago. And the Supreme Court has indicated that it is willing to re-examine that decision and decide if it is appropriate to give that much deference to agencies. And so that presents other interesting avenues to argue. I don't know that that will exactly help Coinbase in this situation, but it does indicate that there's a little bit of a sea change with sort of what I would call activist agencies running around and making sort of policy decisions that are not consistent with what Congress wants, clearly, because there's bipartisan movement on this bill that that the Financial Services Committee has been pushing forward. So although I'll say the timeline for those kinds of appeals is years afterwards.
Right.
So
what happens in the interim while Coinbase is going through this legal process? Did they just carry on business as usual? So they don't have to cease what they're doing with the altcoins that they're listing. They just carry on as normal, and this process just works its way through the system. Is that how it works?
I'm not aware of whether or not the SEC has sought any kind of freeze order. I know in Binance there was a fight about freezing the assets, and my understanding was that the court said that they can operate during the pendency. Yeah. So I'm not sure that the SEC has sought the same relief in the Coinbase suit. I don't believe they have. And so the Coinbase can continue to operate absent court order. And frankly, I think all signs point to they're going to, because that all feeds into their sort of argument that this is not a security and we're within our rights to do this. And so, there's been talk of them moving pieces of their operations offshore. If they did move offshore, it wouldn't moot the lawsuit. It would just change how they operated going forward. And that obviously is their business decision. And, again, I understand a company who says, yeah, if I'm not welcome here, then I'm out. But, I hope that Coinbase will stay the course, because I do think it keeps the pressure on the SEC to continue to justify its actions, and they're running out of justifications for it. But it's that's a very much a business decision for Coinbase, and I'm certain they're having those conversations with their counsel.
So there was a bill introduced recently as well to fire Gary Gensler, and restructure the way that the SEC works. If that were to proceed, so if it did go through, let's say it does get approved, is there a potential that the SEC could drop the lawsuit? Is that another possible outcome?
The SEC always has the option to dismiss their claims. It would be very interesting. Well, first of all, I don't know if that restructure bill is very interesting and is an interesting thought experiment. I don't know how much momentum it currently has. But if it did go through, again, I think, given the way how divided the Congress is right now, all of these things have an uphill battle in the Senate, which is again why lobbying efforts are something that we've been recommending to our clients. But if it did go through, the SEC could drop their suit. I don't know. There might be some internal policy or rules that they have about what happens when when one regime comes in and one goes out, that I'm not aware of, but there could be some sort of we don't like to overturn prior administrations, but in this case, it could happen. But again, I think that's 2 years away. I think if there was a turnover in the White House, then from a partisan perspective, I think that is the fastest way to get rid of Gary Gensler at this point, and that's again 2 years. So it's all of the avenues are still a long ways off, and we hope that maybe something will break sooner rather than later. But there is the lack of, I would say, sort of the activist SEC, and the need to rein them in would be from an executive level, which they've sort of they're not doing it, and the legislative process just takes a lot more time. And the courts are not really the place that you want to hash this out, because people can, even if the SEC took a big hit in, the Ripple case or in Grayscale or whatever it was, even if they took a hit, the SEC would take that decision and say, okay, well, it only applies to this very narrow box. And so that doesn't
help the industry.
Legislating by litigation, just like legislation by enforcement, is not a perfect answer. It's the option that people are availing themselves of now, but it's not a perfect answer. Clarity is necessary. I think the industry as a whole is starting to come around to that thought. And I think from an internal perspective, we have to educate each other about, just because we want regulation doesn't mean we're talking about CBDCs, right? That's not what, there's a lot of in between there, and we're not, and it seems to me that sort of central bank issue is, at least in this country, is not having a lot of momentum. In other countries, I think for sure you're having a lot more discussion about that, but the US doesn't have a central bank is very foreign to the US. I think in a lot of other jurisdictions, that's not such a foreign concept. And so there's a much higher, I think there's a much bigger hill there to get over here. And it frankly just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's true. And I agree.
Our economic system.
Yeah. I guess one last question I wanted to ask you before we wrap up is about sort of the state level regulation. So Texas has obviously come out of the gate as kind of I guess we should have expected it, because I think Texas, culturally being Texas, it was probably going to embrace an industry that was good for Texas. So they've very much come out the gate with some seemingly very friendly regulation, and it's become a very good jurisdiction for doing business in this space. Wyoming is another one that has also come out the gate, very friendly regulation, very pro Bitcoin, pro crypto. So I guess my question is there anything that which states would you say are doing things better, and what are they doing better versus other ones? And for example, is there anything that Texas could learn from Wyoming and vice versa? And what should other states be looking to do? Like Florida seems like it's sort of fairly neutral. They're obviously, DeSantis is obviously anti-CBDC, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of other kind of very clear kind of positioning as to say we're a friendly state to digital assets. Like, what do you kind of think about when you think about the jurisdictional arbitrage at a state level?
Yeah, it is interesting. And, I think it probably has a lot to do with, again, who your constituents are and do they want this? Because I think if you asked, your standard House representative for Texas, do they hear from people who want, better crypto laws? The answer might be no. It depends on where they'd be from, right? But there is, we have a number of trade organizations that have sort of staked this ground. Our firm is members of the Texas Blockchain Council, who we have mutual acquaintances at. And that, I think, is really their efforts to lead the pack and push the agenda. Frankly, that's the way that politics works, right? I mean, and that's the way somewhat legislation does. Either something bad happens and they take legislation and they say, okay, we need to fix this, or it is proactive, grassroots, hey, we need this to, keep Texas, as the front runner in in among the states from a business perspective, which is a competition among the states. Texas's mild disadvantage in this is that we have a very oddly structured legislative session. Our legislature is part-time, and they only meet once every 2 years for like 5 months. And so it's a
I didn't realize that. Oh my God. Right.
So like I was taking a look at sort of what Wyoming has done in the last few years, and the sheer number of things that they've accomplished is because they have a different structure. They have the time to do so. And so Texas, I think, has been very focused, particularly at the mining industry, because that has a lot of synergy both with oil and gas, obviously, but also with our grid, because we have an independent grid. And there's been a lot of discussion about using mining to support the grid and all of that. And so that's been the primary focus of Texas, I think. And we saw a little bit in this last session. There was a Dow bill that didn't quite get through. But that I think will be certainly coming up in the next session. And I would not be surprised if a more broader, similar to what Wyoming did for securities law, the state securities board. So we actually heard somebody speak about this at Consensus. There's this idea that creating exemptions under the state law can be used to at least demonstrate a level of compliance if the SEC comes calling. It's not a perfect shield, but it's possible that kind of reliance on state exemptions might have some compliance mitigation factors. And I think that is something that Texas should seriously consider for its next session, because that would put us, Wyoming has one, and it again doesn't prevent the federal government from coming to knock on your door, but it is something, and it's a demonstration of compliance. And so Texas, I think, should consider something like that. I think a Dow bill, the one that was up, I think had some problems. Frankly, I thought the minimum requirement for members was way too high. I think it was 500. Which is a lot. Yeah, it was a lot. And the pitch that I made to the Texas Blockchain Council when I talked to Lee Bratcher about this was, I think the problem that you'll face with that is managing a 500-person decentralized autonomous organization is difficult. But also it is that a bar to entry for, the organizations that really do want to use this as a force for social change and all of those things. Do you create kind of a bar to entry? Sure, maybe it's great for the, A16Z sort of DAOs of the world, but, are you creating a bar to entry? But also, there are other legal structures that you can use to wrap your DAO that exist in Texas. We have unincorporated nonprofit associations already as a recognized entity. So yes, I think maybe frankly the word is it's trendy to do a DAO bill. I don't know that it's 100% necessary. And certainly I think the one that was up for this session could have used a little bit of work, but I think that that's something that we'll see again come up, and maybe in a refined form. Wyoming already has one. California just proposed not necessarily a DAO bill, but they are talking about an unincorporated association structure. I guess they don't have one in California. Colorado has one, which it sounds to me is based on the condominium sort of, it's like a condominium structure. So there are states that are talking about this issue. Whether we'll see more states taking up what I think is the more pressing issue of the securities exemptions, I think it will depend on who is calling for that. And that really, I think, ultimately is the driver for a lot of this type of legislation, is who's calling up Congress people and lobbying them and saying, we need this. This is why we need this. This is why this is important for Colorado or Wyoming or Texas to be crypto friendly. And I think that certainly if we're hearing this at the federal level, I'm sure it's also true at the state level, is people want to understand it and they want to know what they're, if it's why it's good for the economy, because a lot of the rhetoric is, oh, it's, for drug dealers and terrorists. And, we're still talking about that. And again, like, that's the problem that I think we have, is we're still talking about that. And yes, there are bad people who would do bad things in all structures.
I mean, I think that's such an asinine argument, by the way, because if you take that, then you should just ban fiat because that's used for drug dealers. I mean, I guess that makes the case
exactly.
for the CBDC, right? But I mean, if you have yeah, if you have a human right to transact, which we should and do have, then, at the end of the day, it's like, yes, you can use any type of tool for illicit activity. It's like saying, we're going to ban houses because some people run illicit businesses out of houses, so we can't have houses. I mean, where does that kind of end? It's such a dumb argument. I get really sick of that. There was a British journalist in the FT who wrote an article recently about this, and at Bitcoin Policy UK we actually did a rebuttal for it because it was just ridiculous, and it was not, it had no basis in facts. Like, the data in there was just, not showing a true picture of what illicit activity looks like. It's just
well, and as my mother was a statistician, and as she says, you can make data say pretty much anything. And so it is an asinine argument. But if the industry as a whole does not take the time to educate, which I think is ultimately the thing that we are telling clients, is without education, you're not going to get anywhere. And it's about what you're saying, but it's also about who is being the spokespeople. And that is, I think, the point with the growing up, right? Is like, the industry has so many good examples of use cases for crypto that are, solve legitimate but good, like, problems that the technology is perfect for. And those are the people that we should be talking about. Yes, the FTX thing, which frankly I think was entirely silly greed driven. Yes, that took a hit to the industry, and it is reverberating and will likely reverberate for quite a while. But it's almost old news. Like, in the interim, we have all of these, companies that are trying to take this technology and do very cool things with it. And like, those are the people that you're shutting down with all of this rhetoric, not because illicit activity is going to happen. Like, we have laws that prevent drug trafficking, and we're still there's still drug traffickers. So that will always happen. But you're shutting down legitimate businesses who are solving legitimate problems that, traditional technology has not been able to solve. And the thing that I continue to say, and I'm beating a dead horse, is when was this country not about innovation? And that's ultimately, I think, the thing that is being stifled is innovation. And it's sad. And that should not be our position. And we shouldn't be falling behind other countries that are, taking a much more nuanced and proactive approach.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But I think that's a good place to end then. Don't stifle innovation. Thank you so much, Monica.
Yes, I think thank you so much, Krista. This was so lovely, and it was good to see you, and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully I'll see you soon.
I think I'll see you in November, because you're going to be down for the summit.
I think so, yeah.
I will see you in November then. Yeah.
Amazing.